Hello, everyone. This is the Montana Democratic Party's Blue Bench podcast. My name is Gabby Previtt. I'm the Communications Director with the Montana Democratic Party. We hope you had a great 4th of July. Today, I'm excited to introduce our special guest on the podcast. Representative James Reavis joins us on the show this week. He represents House District 47 in Billings, which covers Southside Triangle, downtown Billings, and Central Terry. Representative Reavis, thanks for being on the show this week.
Thanks for having me, Gabby. Happy to talk to you about the session and what Montana Democrats are doing to put a good path forward.
Great. So I'm sure you're aware, and maybe a lot of our listeners, season 1 of our podcast really started out as this kind of weekly analysis, breaking down some of the biggest headlines and bills making their way through the Capitol building. So since the end of the session, we've expanded our coverage, kind of localizing what we're seeing happening in Washington and how folks in Montana are being impacted by a Republican-led Congress and the Trump administration. But today, we really do want to refocus back to the legislature, and we want to hear from you about some of Governor Gianforte's pesky vetoes of some very popular bipartisan bills we've seen get struck down in the last few weeks. And we're curious about your takeaways from the session and wondering what we're seeing in Washington, how the, quote, big, beautiful bill will impact all of the work from the 2025 session and what the future holds for legislators. So perhaps a special session. So lots to cover. Where should we begin? I guess first I'd like to ask you, what were your overall impressions of the 2025 session?
It was a very intense experience. I was a freshman legislator, and I wasn't totally new to the legislature. I had been helping write bills behind the scenes. I had been testifying in committees. I had, of course, watched debates. But when you're actually an elected representative, boy, that's a whole other experience. You start off at, first you wake up hopefully early enough to get some exercise. Then you do what's called the caucus call, where you get on the phone with all of the other Democrats in the caucus, where you talk about the bills that are coming up for the day. And then right after that, you're into morning committees. And then you've got lunch, which is one chance to interact with other members of the legislature, afternoon committee, floor session, and then it's 5 o'clock, but then you probably have a social event to attend. And then you repeat it and do it all over again. So it was a very intense experience. It turns out it's just a little more than pressing yes or no on the button when you're voting. But I really did enjoy it. I'm going to be running for a second term, so happy to continue serving the constituents of Billings. One of the things, though, a bill has to go through a lot of different stages. And, I'm sure in your earlier podcasts, you heard about, how's this going to get through the House? How's this going to get through the Senate? But, the final step is the governor. And, what we've had here is a series of very disappointing, wrong-headed, and I believe incorrect decisions that were made by Governor Gianforte. And it's been extremely frustrating because the way they did this, the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, they made a lot of statements saying that they were independent and separate from Governor Gianforte. But what ended up happening is that they held all of these bills. So what you have to do under the rules is you have to wait to get a signature from the Speaker or the Senate President before it goes to the governor. You hold on to that, and they waited until after the session was over, right? Because if they vetoed these during the session, you could call for a motion on the floor to override them, right? They wait until after the session is over when the heat is off. And then they just vetoed one bill after another. And these were some very bipartisan, popular, important bills. Now, some of them cannot be overridden because not enough people voted for them when they were in the session. But a lot of them were eligible for what's called a veto poll. But a veto poll is a cumbersome process where it has to go through the mail. You have to get it, or you have to go to the post office. You have to fill it out, right? And you get some drop off with that. I think our Democrats have been very strong in getting those veto polls filled out. But Republicans, if they don't want to face a tough vote, they don't want to stand up to Governor Gianforte, they just won't open the mail. And so this has been it's been a very, how do I say this? It's been a learning process that just because you get something through both chambers of the House, it doesn't mean it's going to become law. And and these vetoes were done to veto some really popular, important measures. I have some of those I'd love to talk to you about, but go ahead, Gabby.
Yeah, I will be asking you about this, but I want to make sure I understand. So we're talking about, in theory, bipartisan bills, right? These bills needed support from obviously Republicans and Democrats to get to the governor's desk. But it sounds like you might be suggesting, well, maybe not totally bipartisan. Is that what I'm hearing you say about some of these bills then?
What I think what I'm saying is that these bills needed a lot of these bills did need the support because Montana Democrats increased their numbers in the legislature, right? Because of our hardworking volunteers and campaigners, we got 42 Democrats in the House. And that means that that's a very powerful voting bloc and leverage. And so our support was very important to getting a lot of these bills passed. That we're going to do things like help our first responders, provide Medicaid coverage, and help out our seniors. But what ended up happening is that, we worked together and passed these, but then on the back end, Governor Gianforte stopped those bills. And what I'm nervous about is that the Republican support that we worked on and gathered is not going to show up on the veto override. Most of Gianforte's vetoes have not been overridden. And that just shows that the Republicans and Democrats are not always being equal partners here. And the solution is to elect more Democrats because they are going to stand up for our first responders and our seniors and our people who really, and all Montanans who need health care. And these vetoes, they're out of the spotlight, right? You're not hearing them on the news. You just hear, oh, he vetoed 18 more bills, or he vetoed another batch of bills. And it doesn't carry that news coverage. So it's a really underhanded way to undermine really popular policies. And it's very disappointing that the governor is not looking at these popular policies for the strengths that they can bring to protect Montanans, and he's dropping the veto pen. I just have a fundamental disagreement with the way the governor is conducting his business and running the state of Montana.
That is really, really interesting insight. I know our listeners will appreciate that. Thank you. But let's get into some of those vetoes. What were some of those bills that you, I guess, there were a lot of vetoes, but what are some vetoes that you want to discuss today?
Yeah, I would love to talk to you about the bills that would have protected our first responders, right? Backing the blue, backing our firefighters, backing our emergency medical technicians. So one bill was House Bill 511. That was brought by freshman Representative Scott DeMario out of the Butte Anaconda region. Representative DeMario is a firefighter supervisor, and he brought a bill that would have expanded our firefighter training facilities, would have got more firefighters trained, would have protected Montana homes and businesses. And that was a bill that was vetoed by Governor Gianforte. And he said, I'm going to veto it because we're tightening our budget. Well, the reason we're tightening our budget is because the Republicans on a party line vote cut income taxes that disproportionately benefited the wealthiest Montanans. That's why he's having to cut a budget. It was totally unnecessary. We had the money to pay for that. So that was a very disappointing veto. The other very disappointing veto was SB 394. Now, that was a bill that was brought by Senator Cora Newman, who is definitely a rising star in the party. You want to follow her. And she brought a bill that would have expanded workers' compensation coverage to our first responders who get PTSD on the job. So being an ambulance EMT, a police officer, a firefighter, you face trauma on the job. It's part of your job. You go into the fire, you go into the shooting, you go into those dangerous, tragic situations, and that leaves trauma. That leaves trauma on anybody. And when I learned that you do not, for workers' compensation, it's only for physical injuries and not injuries to the brain, which is what PTSD is. And PTSD, sometimes it's something that you can work through and get back up to full strength. Sometimes it's a little more severe and you need a little more time. But what you need is workers' compensation coverage. And I had a role in writing this bill, and I was proud to, I worked hard on the House to get it through. It wasn't successful, but Senator Newman got it through on the Senate side, and then we got it through on the House side. And then, after the session is over, Gianforte held on to this bill for a month, waited for the heat to die down, waited for the press not to be looking at it, and then he vetoed that bill. And that did not support our first responders, and we're back to where we were at square one. So, yeah, was very disappointed with the governor's decisions to veto that legislation.
Well, let me ask you this. Did that also did he explain that was to, I guess, trim the budget, which was needed to support his income tax initiative?
I don't even fully understand it, because our fiscal note, this would have been a fiscal adjustment of $100,000. And if you know state budgets, $100,000 is not very much, especially compared to the benefits that it would have yielded. A small increase in premiums to make sure that our first responders were protected, that would have been worth it. So there's other bills that I'm also kind of confounded that were vetoed. Senator Christopher Pope brought SB 188. This was a bill about solar energy. Specifically, it would have made it easier for individuals to get a solar panel and plug it into the grid. And so that way, they are in the grid. So when solar energy comes in, they can use it for their own home, and any excess energy they create goes back into the grid to help power other homes, right? It's just getting our alternative energy more coordinated, more in line, just making it easier to adopt solar energy. And that bill was vetoed. Representative Seconder brought a bill that would have done a river study on the Smith River, right? How are we using our rivers to provide recreation to Montana's residents and Montana tourists, right? Are we using the river in a healthy way? We needed more information. That bill was also vetoed. So, when it comes to our environment, I just disagree with the way the governor is addressing these veto decisions. We need multiple forms of energy. We need to make sure that our public lands, right, public water and access to recreation, that's a constitutional right. A clean and healthy environment is a constitutional right. And these vetoes have imperiled that progress. And one of the most, speaking of impairing progress, one of the vetoes that I'm most disappointed in was House Bill 881. This was brought by Representative Cafaro. She is now finishing out her last term. She one of Montanans' longest serving representatives, an expert in the field of Medicaid. And House Bill 881 would have provided additional Medicaid coverage to children with disabilities. So children who, through no fault of their own, are facing a health condition or a health crisis, and they need help. And there you have a donut hole, right, where the parent makes more than the Medicaid eligibility, but the treatment is so expensive you can't afford it on a middle class salary, even with decent insurance. And to have that bill vetoed was extremely disappointing. And if healthcare and children with disabilities, if you're more of a, as a Democrat, that's very important to me. But if you're someone more on the fiscal side, where it's like, is money being distributed appropriately? Well, let's look at House Bill 831. So this was a bill that was brought by a Republican. This was brought by George Nikolakakis. But he got Republicans and Democrats together to vote for this bill. This is a bill that would have expanded a property tax credit for our senior citizens. So one of the big things that I heard is that senior citizens are disproportionately affected by property tax hikes because they are on fixed incomes and they're living in a house, and that the volatility of that property tax affects them disproportionately. So especially when you're on a lower income, maybe you're living mostly on Social Security, right? Or you don't have a pension. You have a 401k that maybe didn't get as much as you wanted. So that tax credit would have helped keep senior citizens in their homes. And so, again, we passed a lot of property tax reform, which I'm happy to talk about, but this was a piece of the puzzle. And Gianforte's veto again, right, when the heat was off, right, had these vetoes happened during the session, right, we would have been able to talk about vetoing not helping children with disabilities, vetoing not helping senior citizens stay in their homes, right? And that is what is so nefarious about, nefarious may not be the right word, but what is so frustrating is that the Speaker and the Senate President, they sat on these bills. They didn't make the last signature. They waited until the session was over, and then they vetoed it.
Wow. All the bills you listed off, they seem like no-brainers. And obviously there were Republicans that supported these bills as well.
Yes.
Are we hearing any pushback or anything from Republicans watching the governor veto these bills, or have they just remained silent?
They've largely remained silent. I'll give some credit to George and Melissa Nikolakakis. They have advocated for having, for their bill, and that's good on them. And and of course the Democrats have been pretty united on the bills that I talked to you about, and many others. But here's like the thing. There was a lot of talk. We heard in the opening remarks of the session that the legislature was the legislature, and they were going to show independence from Governor Gianforte. That's their words. But when we look at their actions, we ended up seeing, right? We put in some good bills, right? If you were going to vote against that bill, that's a tough vote. So, we saw them take the vote that was right, and then they let the governor do the dirty work to actually veto the bill. And so I think the fact that these vetoes are not being overridden, even though they should be overridden, and the votes are there to override those vetoes, based if you look at the numbers that they passed, some of them overwhelmingly in the legislature. I think actions speak louder than words, and it suggests that the Republicans in the Montana legislature and the governor are in more alignment than what was presented to us at the start of the session.
I'm sure there's some listeners right now feeling how I'm feeling listening to you explain these vetoes and what's happening. And they're feeling really disheartened. What can folks do right now, I guess, to advocate for some of these bills? Is there any sense in advocating for these bills now? What can we do right now?
Absolutely. So let's take Senator Pope's solar energy bill. I was personally reached out to by people who were upset by the vetoing of that solar bill. I had somebody call in and ask, hey, has your veto override come in yet? Right. So I checked the Secretary of State's website and I saw that I wasn't on there. So I called the Secretary of State's office and say, hey, make sure it gets in there. Right. And so for these vetoes, if you go onto the Secretary of State's website, if this is a veto that you care about and the deadline hasn't passed, go call your representative. ask them, explain to them that this is important. And especially if you call the representative in the district that you live in, right? That's a better chance that they're going to respond to you, right? And here's the thing. I guess if I'm all for injecting optimism, if they voted yes originally, that's remind them that they voted yes and that they should vote for the veto override because it was a good bill and they were right. That is what is so it's frustrating with the governor's vetoes, but we have to understand the only reason we have these veto polls is that 100 out of 150 members of the legislature voted to adopt this. So the votes are there. If you're a representative, like the solar bill or the Medicaid bill, the ones that are still able to have a veto override, if it's an issue that you care about and their vote hasn't been returned yet and they voted yes on it, call them up and say, hey, it's really important to me. You believed that this policy was a good policy. And you stated, right, that you're someone who votes their conscience, right? And you're not beholden to Governor Gianforte. The way you establish that you're not beholden to the governor or to the president is to make a vote that reflects that.
I might switch over then to the big, beautiful bill.
The big, beautiful bill, as it's called, is it is going to devastate Montana. The provisions that are in that bill, cuts to Medicaid, cuts to STAMP, a huge loss of federal revenue. Montana brings in almost as much as federal revenue as we do in state dollars, maybe a little bit more. That's about half and half. That is going to put a huge strain on all of our programs. And this beautiful bill, Montana has a requirement for a balanced budget. This bill could put us, the bill included a debt ceiling raise of $5 trillion. At a minimum, we're going to borrow another $3.4 trillion. And when you borrow so much money, right, the first priority is those interest payments. And if you're spending your entire budget on interest payments, that's less money to help Americans and Montanans. And I guess, how do I put this? So let's talk about the Medicaid cuts. That's really like the big one that I know the most about. So there's something called FMAP, which is federal matching aid percentage. That number is not being changed. However, there's still a cut in Medicaid because they're creating work requirements. And so keep in mind, right, 90% of Medicaid recipients already work. The rest have a disability that's so serious, or they're a caregiver, or there's some other very appropriate reason they are not working. And so, but the reason we know it's a cut is because we know that if you require the verification, the income verification forms, the pay stubs, somebody needs to sign something, right? When you introduce paperwork requirements, people fall off the rolls. They can measure it, and they know that when people fall off of Medicaid, they're not spending money on their medical procedures. And that's $1 trillion in cuts. And one of the things I will say, one of the things that I'm very grateful for as being a legislator is I feel like I can do something about it. So once this bill passed, I got onto, a text thread with the other representatives, and I said, hey, these work requirements are going to become a thing. Can we do something to make it less painful? And so I am in the process of working with other representatives, reaching out to Montana's departments and agencies to see if we can automate this, right? Like, People are already reporting their income to the Department of Revenue. The Department of Labor and Industry is keeping statistics, right? In fact, the Department of Health and Human Services has to verify that the forms are correct, right? So let's skip that application and let's use the data we already have to verify that people are working. Let's make it automatic. Let's make it more straightforward. So I believe that Democrats are going to propose solutions to address this federal law. We don't want to be a situation like in Georgia, which is what this work requirement is being modeled after. And people, they are employed and they are working, but this paperwork, right? Republicans are supposed to be against bureaucracy and paperwork. And imposing this bureaucracy and paperwork is kicking people off of Medicaid. And when you don't have health insurance, your chronic conditions get worse. You end up in the emergency room. And if we start filling up our emergency rooms, that's going to affect everyone's health care, whether you have insurance or no insurance or Medicaid or anything. If the emergency rooms are full, you are not going to get adequate health care.
Montana's Department of Health and Human Services is going to implement work requirements and cost sharing for Medicaid expansion at least a year earlier than they would have under H.R. 1. What are Montana Dems in the legislature doing?
Yeah, I wish the enthusiasm to implement these work requirements. I wish I had seen it in opening our social assistance offices. I wish I had seen that in reforming our Warm Springs system. I wish I had seen that enthusiasm in making sure that we had proper Medicaid coverage for everyone, right? The enthusiasm that they're demonstrating to just fly these work requirements out the window is extremely frustrating. And you know, Democrats, and I'm on the Human Services Committee, and I don't know what form it is going to take yet, but I'm confident that Democrats are going to bring, we have the federal law, so the federal law is the federal law, but we can bring solutions like presumption of coverage, right? We presume that they're eligible for Medicaid, and then they go through the paperwork so they can start receiving health care right away. We can do things like automatic renewal, right? Like, you are assumed to still be employed, because we can check our tax records, we can check our labor records, we can already verify that you're working. We don't need you to fill out another form to do that. So we can tinker at the edges here. We can apply for what are called Medicaid waivers, and we can do things to verify and keep people on the rolls to get the Medicaid that they deserve, because everyone deserves health care. So I am very confident that the Montana Democrats are going to bring solutions, and I hope that we will have a solution ready to present at the 2027 session, or if we have to go into special session, I'm really hoping we can present something for that. I presume you might have a question about the special session.
I mean, do you think there's going to be a special session? What are you thinking? What's the timeline for all that looking like for you?
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm also on the Revenue Committee. So we're going to be having a meeting at the Revenue Committee on Friday where we're going to learn a little bit more about the estimated amount of revenue that will be coming in over the next 2 years. And if that revenue is too far out of whack with our initial estimations, we will have to go into a special session because of the big, beautiful bill if it devastates Montana's revenue too much. Again, we're not going to have final numbers on that for a little while, but we'll hopefully have an update in about 4 to 6 months.
Okay. I like to try and end the show with a call to action, because a lot of the times it's information overload for some folks and a lot of doom and gloom. So my last question for you would be, how do you suggest Montanans stay engaged and continue to fight even when it feels like sometimes it's just amounting to nothing.
Well, let's talk about what Montana Democrats accomplished this session. And we accomplished this because of what you did and your interaction in contacting your legislators and staying informed and being involved with your central committees. Here's what we did as Montana Democrats. We secured Medicaid permanently. Medicaid itself, the expanded program, was set to sunset. We have permanently removed the sunset provision. We did that because Montana Democrats came together and fought for that. I had the privilege of being at that hearing where we passed that bill. And that was because of you and the work that you did. Montana Democrats stopped partisan judges from passing. That was a lot of work and it wasn't easy, but we want a fair judiciary that isn't placating to one party or the other. And we passed real, if imperfect, property tax relief. Those property tax bills would not have passed without the support of Democrats. And we made sure we didn't get everything we wanted, but we made sure that you're going to see lower property taxes on your house, the house that you live in as a Montana resident. So keep in mind, because of your efforts, we already did a lot. So I think you need to feel good about what you were able to accomplish, and the the journey is not done. And what we need to do, there are local elections coming up this year, right? So city races, county commissioner races, and school board races. Those races are really important because those growing a good group of governing local officials, that creates the bench, maybe a blue bench, for building really good state legislative candidates like Paul Tuss, who can compete in places like Havre, right? So focus on your local elections because you're going to get good people who can then run for the state legislature in the future. And we have a map that is the districts were redrawn, and so now the map is competitive and open to your good candidate. So you could consider running for office yourself. Support your local county central committee. If there's an issue you're particularly passionate about, focus on what gets you out of bed, right? You're going to have to get these things done. You're going to have to go knock doors. You're going to have to make phone calls. You're going to have to write emails. Well, do it make it something that you care about, right? If you're upset about the big, beautiful bill, well, find people who are also upset about that. If you need to join an indivisible group, right? If you're passionate about someone who is running for mayor, volunteer for their campaign. Go where your passion takes you, because we all need to work together, and collectively is when we make the difference. We've already seen an upswing. We have seen an upswing in gaining more seats at the legislature. And, I just got to tell you, the last 2 years, or no, last 6 months notwithstanding, we had a Democrat in the Senate for almost 100 years. So don't think that Montana is a red state. We are an independent purple state, and and the reason we are that is because we have the better policies. We have the policies that are going to protect our first responders, that are going to provide property tax relief, that are going to respect our environment, and that are going to provide health care coverage to everyone. We're not going to pass bills that just disproportionately affect the wealthiest people. Why? We're going to be in a budget crunch next session because we passed this income tax cut where the wealthiest Montanans, okay, they'll pay, $10,000 less. That's what we want to do. I don't think that's what the Democrat Party is about. And I don't think that's what Montanans are about. I think Montanans actually want to see improvement in their lives. And they also want to be fiscally responsible, because the path that both the state Republicans and the national Republicans, they're putting us on a fiscally irresponsible path. And we don't need to keep seeing, when I'm in the legislature, I want to see issues that are affecting Montanans. And all too often, I saw conservatives pushing national policies on us. How many votes did we have to take on girls in sports? Like, why this took up hours of floor time when we could have been talking about our environment, we could have been talking about our property taxes, we could have been talking about our health care. But instead, we're talking about women in sports, right? And so, whether it's our state politics or our national politics, find something that you're passionate about, because it is your involvement that makes the difference and makes the change.
Great. Well, Representative Reavis, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us on the podcast. Again, thank you for your hard work in the legislature. I hope you're having some restful days this summer after a hard session, and we appreciate all that hard work. So thank you.
Of course, anytime.